Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to be sharing about the Grace Hopper celebration that a number of individuals in the tech org went to back in October. So just really quickly, we're going to be talking about what is Grace Hopper and then going through a few of our favorite talks from this in the areas of current tech, future tech, and culture. So what is Grace Hopper? The Grace Hopper organization was created in 1994. It's inspired by the legacy of Admiral Grace Murray Hopper. Their main event each year is the Grace Hopper Celebration, which brings the research and career interests of women in computing to the forefront. So what this actually looks like is the world's largest gathering of women technologists with over 30,000 attendees from 115 countries. There were over 250 speakers at 200 sessions, which include talks and workshops from just so many different tracks, including engineering, data science, DEI, product management, security, VR, HR, many more. So we'd love to tell you about all 200 talks, but we're going to keep it short today and just go over a few of our favorites. I'm going to hand it over to Macy to start with one of our favorites from the current tech area.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. So I went into this conference with a specific goal of learning more about code reviews. So I attended 2 different talks on it. And the main theme I got was that the language we use in reviews is important for the broader team environment and how we perceive the comments we get. So these are the 5 main takeaways that I got from the talks. So the first one is to use actionable statements. So this would be saying, can you run the linter on this file versus your formatting is bad? This helps the author know what to do to fix a suggestion. And then the second one is to ask clarifying questions. So saying, why was this function added instead of, you don't need this? This gives the reviewer an opportunity to learn about the code and also gives the author the benefit of the doubt. The next one is to use collaborative language, saying, we should refactor this instead of you should refactor this. This just doesn't sound accusatory and also helps with it's our code versus your code. And then find a balance between constructive versus overly critical. So for this, the presenter recommended using optional in front of an optional comment. So this could be something that doesn't affect code functionality and isn't as important, but could be making a variable more descriptive. And the last one is my favorite one, which is to give positive feedback. I never really thought about this with reviews since it's either leave a comment or approve the code and be done with it. But taking the time to say, hey, this refactor looks great, or this function works really well, just helps with, oh, sorry, there's someone talking. So these things help embrace code reviews with a growth mindset instead of taking criticism personally. And I've been working on incorporating these in code reviews, and I'm super excited to use these more.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be sharing about a talk I found particularly interesting. It was given by Sadia Hamid. She's a principal software engineer at Salesforce. And she discussed how Salesforce has a monolithic code base with 1 million+ tests. And it was making it really hard for their developers to know what tests were impacted by their changes and for their CI to keep up with. So they wanted to find a way to get a prioritized list of relevant tests for the change lists that were coming in. So they ended up creating a test prioritizer machine learning model to produce a list of recommended tests to run. One thing that they used for this model was code coverage. So the larger code coverage a test had for a file that was part of the change list, the higher the score it received. They also used text similarity in different ways, one of those being creating an abstract syntax tree and pulling variables and method names and matching those against the code in the change list for similarities. They also used a user to test recommender, so using teams and areas of code a user tended to focus on. However, they realized that once a user broke a test once or twice, they tended not to break it again as they caught that and would check it before submitting their change list, so they ended up not including that in their model. In the end, they had a linear regression model their developers can use to get, say, the top 100 test recommendations and run that locally, or their CI can ask for the top 5,000 or however much to run. And she presented the results of their model, and they found that they could catch 60 to 80% of failures by just running the top 2,000 test recommendations out of their 1 million total tests. And this has really allowed for their developers to get feedback on their changes much quicker and for CI resources to be freed up. And for me, the team I on assortment, while we have nowhere near like 1,000,000+ tests, it was really interesting to see how another team tackled their growing pains around testing. And with that, I'll pass it to Charlotte.
Thanks, Madeline. Your talk on the test prioritization machine learning model feeds really well into the topic I'd like to share about my GHC experience regarding advances in artificial intelligence. Like many of the women who attended GHC might agree, I think it can be well emphasized how vast and thorough the discussions were that were available for review. I went to the experience with multiple perspectives in mind, but primarily those of an SPS employee, woman in tech, as well as my own personal interest areas. Personally speaking, I've always been interested in every part of the human component of tech and in matters of how the mind parallels so much with what we've developed in this field already. So I was really excited to see so much shared on this topic under the realm of artificial intelligence at GHC. And just to talk about some of those subjects, I think a good way to break down all of those different talks was maybe two general areas here. Just talking a little bit about some of the examples of current work in AI and how we're practically implementing that. And the other side of it being the human and ethical implications of AI, particularly looking to the future. First at GHC, I saw some exciting perspectives on what we and women in particular, since this did center around women, and what we're actively doing in the field to learn about and advance AI in a technical capacity. A few of the valuable talks I attended were first on the development of an AI supercomputer. There was a discussion on understanding and addressing the limitations of our currently functional but restrictive AI algorithms and hardware, as well as acknowledging the pressing need for super accelerators that have the necessary compute power to efficiently train our AI models of the future. There was also a talk on using spiking neural networks, which more closely resemble natural biology and better simulate integration of information over time than traditional neural network models. And finally, we had a talk on how we can better process language to interact more humanly with users via considerations of language, style, content, and structure with the use of text generation AI software. I can go into more detail, but that's just trying to give you a good overview of some of the really cool things that they had shared there. A second area that I thought was interesting regarding AI was a number of talks centering around the ethics and humanity of AI. There's one talk in particular I was excited to highlight here, which was called Human-Centered AI, using Magic Leap's digital human Micah as a reference point for the discussion. I can also share a link to this feature as well. There's a video on introducing Micah. But a few key points that this talk brought up were, first, considering the future ethical implications of how we program our AI now. With Micah in particular, this digital human was in the female form, and it was mentioned that we should take some caution in choosing to preserve a stereotype of the past, particularly that of women taking on a more stereotypically subservient role like assistant or secretary, in something that could have the capacity to influence our interactivity both with tech and with each other in the future. And then a second piece was how AI is an inevitable part of the future, but it's also something that we can have the power to integrate, not in a way of being dominated by it or purely served by it, but rather with the potential to enhance our collaboration across both the human and technical realms. I especially liked what Alice Rowe in this talk had to say about AI having the capacity to elevate, not compromise humanity. And finally, when bringing this back to a bit of a more of SPS perspective, I don't think that we currently work directly with any kind of AI tech at SPS. That said, I could see value potentially in AI development, maybe enhancing the customer experience or as a tool for evaluating prospects, or even as a way of improving our internal tooling. Beyond that, even in our most basic programs or projects, I think that we can still take the idea that was discussed here of respectful, technically valuable, and conscientious human tech interactions to heart. A perfect recent example of this is the master domain changes we've been currently making in our repos. It's seemingly small improvements, even not necessarily in AI specifically, but improvements in the now that can provide the groundwork for integrating socially responsible human compassionate technology, AI or otherwise, at SPS in the future. In any case, I thought all of the discussions I referenced here had some interest and value worth sharing. So to continue some of this discussion on the future technology related to GHC, I will pass it over to Jessica.
Great. Thanks, Charlotte. So as far as future tech goes, my favorite talk was Home Automation and Inclusive Design by Kate Freeburn and Rachel Bean. They were both engineers working at Google, specifically developing the Google Nest. So they talked about making technology accessible and inclusive so that our products can reach a wider user base and be helpful to everyone. And since they worked on the Google Nest, they focused mostly on smart technology that serves the home. So I picked out my favorite quote from the talk. We are biased towards the culture we come from, our privilege, and our experience. So we need to change our way of thinking to empathize outside of our own experiences. There's many different aspects of technology to take into account when considering an equal experience for everyone. And there's pros and cons to everything, so we have to try to accommodate as many as possible with the features we choose to include. So Kate and Rachel, since they were talking about smart technology, they focused on touch, voice, and gestures or gaze of smart technology. So for example, touch can have some cons since touching buttons and a screen are the least natural way for humans to communicate. Older people have problems with touch because of skin moisture and conductivity, and there's obvious issues for those with paralysis or mobility issues and impaired vision. But touch on computers is necessary for those with impaired speech or hearing, and it is the default way for humans to communicate with computers right now. A great alternative to touch would be using voice, which is a more natural way to communicate for humans. It's obviously helpful to those who can't really use touch as well, but it is impossible to use for those with impaired speech or hearing. And it may even be hard to use for those with accents. So we have to accommodate for languages when incorporating voice into our technology. And our last thing is gestures or gaze, which is kind of newer to technology right now. So you can unlock your phone with a look instead of reading out or typing in your password, which is really great. But you have to keep in mind to be inclusive of all cultures, as some hand gestures are considered offensive in some that aren't to others. And of course, using your gestures or gaze to unlock or use a smartphone or smart technology is unusable for those with certain physical disabilities. Technology also has to be inclusive as well as accessible. So we have to keep in mind technology's role in enforcing or dismantling gender bias, kind of like what Charlotte was saying before. For example, when Siri first came out, when responding to comments of being called hot or the B word, she responded, "I'd blush if I could." This has some negative connotations, especially for an AI with a female voice and name. So in 2019, creators changed this answer to, "I don't know how to respond," which is a little bit better. There's also implications behind always giving AI female names and voices, since their purpose is mostly to serve and mainly in the house. We also have to consider the use of diverse data. We all might remember the initial problems with facial recognition, only recognizing mostly Caucasian people because of data not being diverse enough. So it's just another thing to keep in mind. So the big question is, how is technology supposed to help everyone if it only includes some of us? These are just some of the suggestions to make technology more accessible and inclusive, and I think it's pretty vital that everyone keep these in mind when creating anything. Now I will pass it back on to Jenna.
Thanks, Jessica. For our last two future tech talks here, I'm just going to do a really quick highlight on two others that we thought were cool. The first was given by two engineers who work at Google. They're currently working on a problem that they call the blue dot problem. And this is when you come out of a building or a subway or something and you pull your phone out, pull up your map, and you see a little blue dot. You don't know which way you're supposed to walk until you start walking and you see which way the dot goes. So this is a common issue that actually causes a lot of significant stress for people. But because GPS and compass are skewed in cities, they're working on a new technology right now that they're calling global localization. So they just kind of walked through some of what they're doing. And the way that they're trying to solve this right now is using visual positioning service, VPS, which looks at what's around you. So buildings, bridges, big landmarks. And they're combining that with Street View, which Google has millions and millions of images right now from all around the world, along with machine learning to create what they're calling global localization. So that when you pull out your phone, hopefully in the future, instead of just seeing a blue dot that you can't tell which way to go, hopefully you'll see something more helpful, like an arrow. And the second talk here was on Femtech. It was given by Samantha Cohn from McKinsey and Company. And Femtech stands for female technology. And basically this is being created now to meet women's health needs. So historically, almost all spending and study has been on men, and women were then expected to adapt. And what was kind of surprising to me was until 1993, the FDA did not actually allow women to even participate in clinical studies, despite huge differences in the likelihoods of developing certain diseases or conditions. Women have basically just been treated like small men. So additionally, women make about 90% of healthcare decisions in a household. And there's this huge industry that's basically not been tapped until now. And they're realizing it's a $50 billion industry. And just in the last few years, there's been over 200 femtech companies started, mostly founded by women, allowing women to build technology by women for women to address their specific health needs. So it was really cool to learn about some of the technology that's coming out in that industry. And I'm going to pass this back to Madeline to talk about one of our talks from current tech or culture.
Thanks, Jenna. Yeah, so this talk that I attended was around privacy, and it was given by Mary Jean Amon, who works at the University of Central Florida. And she discussed how we often think of privacy violations as the sharing of personal information, so medical history, or if there's a data breach and your username and password gets leaked, things like that, but that this also extends to sharing content with unintended audiences, altering original photos or candid photos, and taking a picture of someone without them knowing. The presenter shared how preliminary findings done by her team suggest that there's a racial bias in how Americans perceive other people's right to privacy, where white participants had a higher likelihood of sharing a meme with a Black subject than they did with a meme with a white subject. She also discussed how sharing is becoming a problem and raising ethical concerns with the increased popularity of social media. She described sharing as not necessarily like sharing a developmental milestone or a family photo, but more sharing photos of a child online without their permission that we as adults would find embarrassing, such as a crying tantrum. And overall, the presenter calls for the need for content moderation at the user, corporate, and government levels. We as users can flag content, limit our own posting, ask permission before posting, and starting privacy dialogues by calling out those who violate others' privacy. And across the globe, privacy law is very inconsistent. France has one of the more stricter laws that defines an individual has to consent to having their photo taken, and that this consent does not also include publishing, that has to be asked for as well. And that this actually allows minors the right to object to their parents posting photos of them. And those parents, if they do violate that privacy, they can even face jail time or a fine. So the presenter really wants us to look at content moderation at all three levels, that all these are necessary and that we should be working towards a more proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jenna for her discussion.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about one more talk. It's about making the internet more diverse. And this was given by Dr. Jess Wade, who's a scientist at the Imperial College of London. She talked about how access to and participation in science and technology is not fair. And she actually won she was one of the main award winners at Grace Hopper for the work that she's been doing in this area. So just one note, she gave a lot of statistics. I'm going to share a couple here. The statistics she gave were for the UK, but she mentioned multiple times that the US statistics are very similar in a lot of these areas. So looking at her own science field and then back into school, STEM classes, she noticed what we all know by now, that they're really not diverse. And looking further into why this is, she found that one of the main drivers for individuals to study STEM and stick with it is when they see other people who look like themselves studying the field or working in the field and influencing them in their studies. So primary influencers that girls or individuals of diverse backgrounds, individuals with disabilities might look up to: parents, teachers, books, and online resources. So she started looking into what was available in these areas. Looking at the teachers in the UK, professors specifically, she found there were over 19,000 total professors. 17,000 of these identify as white, and in the entire UK, only 35 are Black women, 1 in physics, 1 in computer science. And she said, again, statistics very similar in the US. Looking at books that individuals might look at, storybooks, less than 20% of main characters are female. Less than 1% are people of color. And of the best-selling storybooks in the last year, there was only 1 main character with a disability. And then looking at textbooks, again, in the UK, not a single textbook in physics, chemistry, or biology has a woman mentioned. And she said, again, in the US, similar statistics. So looking into online resources that girls or people of color, individuals with disability might look to see people like themselves, Wikipedia really stood out. It's the 5th most visited website ever with up to 650 million views a day. It's hugely influential globally. And it also is kind of sneakily influential in that this is where Alexa, Google Home, and Siri all go to get their information. So it's really clear that what's on Wikipedia matters. But she was asking, is what matters on Wikipedia? And the main answer, like resounding no, basically. 80 to 90% of editors are men. Almost all of these are white, and the majority are in North America. So we have this hugely homogenous group of individuals who are writing and editing information that informs people all around the world on so many different platforms. Only 18% of biographies on Wikipedia are about women. Far less are women of color, and far less individuals with disabilities. So we know that when people see someone like themselves in a field or see someone who can influence them in that field, they're more likely to see themselves there in the future and work towards that. But basically what Dr. Wade was saying is anywhere women, girls, people of color, individuals with disabilities look, they're not seeing examples of themselves. It's just not there. So she started asking, how can I use my privilege to advocate for change? And what she started doing back in 2018 was writing 1 biography every day on Wikipedia about a woman or a diverse individual. She had written 1,120 as of October when we heard this talk. She gave one example of Gladys West, who she wrote about, who was subsequently nominated twice for BBC's Top 100 Women. She was inducted into the US Air Force Hall of Fame, and she's been used in multiple teaching resources since, just because she's on Wikipedia and people now know about her. So she really made a case for just using your privilege to include underrepresented individuals, no matter how small that is, wherever you are, no matter who you are. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Macy.
Yeah, so this is our last talk. This presentation was really powerful. I highly recommend everyone watch it. There will be a link posted in the Tech Slack channel after this. This talk was from a group of guys at Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Cape Inclusion, and they talk about their journeys with inclusion that have taken 10 to 20 years. As we dig into diversity and inclusion at SPS, it's important to acknowledge that it's a journey over many years and not just a training class that you attend. It's about asking questions, listening to stories, and being mentors and advocates to others. Amanda Swan brought this video to the CAF team to watch the video together and discuss, and it was really beneficial. So we invited Matt Kokotovich today to give some insight on that experience.
Thanks, Macy. Yeah, so I felt for a while that I've at least understood the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion but watching this video was a good chance for me to reflect on some of the next steps that I can take. One of the takeaways for me was the importance of listening and empathy. Jeremiah Chan from the Facebook patent department told an anecdote about participating in gender diversity training and then talking about it with the rest of his team. He realized that most of the men on his team shared his shock and surprise about some of the things he had learned, but most of the women on his team didn't really act that surprised. And he realized that what he was describing was just part of their everyday life. He talked about how this really highlighted the importance of listening and empathy for him, because he realized in hindsight that the women on his team had told him some of these things already before, but it wasn't until he went through the training that he actually saw and understood what they had been telling him. Hopefully all of us at SPS are getting to a common understanding that our company, our industry, and our country have a lot of room for improvement in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This video was helpful for me to start thinking about some of the next steps I can take, and I think others at SPS would find it useful as well. That's it for me.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for listening to us. We really appreciate being able to share this. And we just want to let you know, a lot of these talks are still available. We have links for them. So if anybody is interested, just let us know and we should be able to help you track it down.